Welcome to the In-Betwixt and In-Between. This is Leadership Limbo, a podcast aimed at helping middle managers and their supervisors embrace the discomfort and power of leading themselves and others in the midst of it all. We blend real insight with practical tools to help you lead with self-awareness, purpose, and influence wherever you are on your leadership journey. I'm Josh Hugo, one of your co-hosts, joined today on an actual Thursday by my good friend and co-host, John Clark. Good morning, John.
Morning, dude. How are you? It's actual Thursday. It's actual Tuesday still for everyone else.
That's right. Yeah. We've been moving our recording dates around, but you're still getting the quality 6 a.m. Mountain Standard Time delivery that you have come to expect and demand from us.
That's right.
Most of the time.
How you doing today? How's it going?
Yeah, good. It's been a nice spring week here in Denver for non-Denver based people. It's been rainy. It's been a little sunny. It's been cool. It actually feels like seasonal weather. So I think that puts me in generally positive mood. How about you?
While this is normally saved for, I think, like mom podcasts, I would say the like May end of school year stuff with kids is a lot right now. It's good. We have like 2 talent shows and tons of end of year meetings and all the stuff about getting ready for summer. So I know I'm rare in this, but we've got a nice little setup for summer. So I'm somewhat excited for it. Excited about not dragging my kids out of bed here in a couple weeks and just letting them sleep if they want. And then they don't have to like leave the house for a while because someone comes to us. So it's busy and I feel like more disoriented than I want to, given I've been very lucky with having some work. But you know, I'm sure you're feeling the same way, just like kids in school and thinking about summer and all that sort of stuff. But
yeah,
so I know it's busy for folks with families, and this time of year you're just gearing up for summer, but hopefully people are anticipating a couple good months here, some good things coming up in the summer, because I know we are. So
yeah, same here. Excited for that. And yeah, busy time of year, kids sports seasons. We're 6 to 7 games a week and end of year activities.
Baseball's crazy, man. I hear about that. Baseball, I feel like people who are in baseball, it's a lot. I haven't started.
Baseball was a lot, and they're long 2-3 hour games. We have soccer, we have flag football.
They don't put like a time limit on baseball games for you all?
They do, but the playoffs were not. So those were long games. But yeah.
But your boy had a good couple hits in the championship.
Yeah, he had a nice drive to left field, which was good for him. So it's kind of fun to see. They're both at the age in which like their own individual performances can still leave them feeling very happy, even if their team gets their butt kicked. They're like, "Did you see that goal?" I'm like, "I did, and I saw the team's 9 goals against you all too." But
unfortunately, for a lot of people, that sticks all the way through their career. I think they, and in leadership, they're like, "Well, I did fine. We failed."
Yeah, it is. We'll get past that stage at some point.
I think that's actually what our episode is about today, to a certain degree. So.
Yeah, it actually is an interesting segue to that. But before we jump in, it's funny, unintentional. But yeah, reminder to subscribe and share this podcast. Download Apple, Spotify, wherever it is that you want to get your podcast. But please share it. Please leave feedback. Maybe we just need to stop asking for it, because then we'll get it. You know, kind of like that distance of like, whatever. Don't rate it. Don't download it. I don't know. Don't even share. We don't care. And then maybe it will compel you to say like, yeah, I really do want to prove those guys wrong. But no, thanks for listening. Thanks for being engaged. We continue to get people coming on to, we've had a number of people reach out recently to be curious about joining the podcast. And so that absolutely is an offer we always will extend to people who are interested. You know how to find us. We'll set up a time to talk, see what we could be bringing you on the podcast for, and might work out. So that being said, John, I want to turn it back to you and give us a little recap of where we left things last week.
Yeah. So over the last 3 episodes, we talked about the idea of psychological safety. And I think we really started with where we think it's gone wrong in many ways, and how folks are misusing it. And then the most recent episode, we really talked about how do you apply that. I think we talked about it. There's lots of ways you can talk about that, and there's lots of ideas to come back to there. But we talked about it in the way that teams get structured. And we provided this new framework, which is a community model form of building community by Scott M. Peck, or M. Scott Peck. I'm going to pick up that book, actually, but it came from a book I read called Effective Coaching by Miles Downing, where the typical one that we talk about, which is forming, norming, no, no, forming, storming, norming, performing, we switch to this idea of how we build pseudo communities that move into chaos, that move into emptying, that finally move into community, you know? And in those community stages is when teams enter flow. They enter quicker
Mm.
decision making. You're kind of in your golden age as a team, knowing you can always revert back into that pseudo community stage. But we talked a lot about, we want to emphasize the element of this, which was the portion of emptying of ego, or emptying, which we refer to as the emptying of ego, of when that stage comes that we have handled conflict, we have gone through it as a team. The idea that individuals, because the team is led well and coached well and they work well together on that, learns through that process of chaos about what does it take to empty my ego so I can fully hear another, I can fully understand their perspective, and I can be willing to adjust, adapt, or maybe even fully take on their perspective if needed for the betterment of the team. And I think it's it's not a direct correlation today. We're kind of leaving the term psychological safety behind for now. I guess it's always with us, but we did think that this had a nice correlation to some of what we're talking about today. And I'm going to let Josh introduce our topic for today. I do think we're interested in these ideas of terms that you'll hear from leaders and things that we're going to kind of combat and talk about. So, Josh, why don't you introduce that for us?
Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, great intro to today. There will be a through line. In fact, I suspect that psychological safety will come back at some level today. But the statement here's a statement that a lot of leaders have made, managers have made. Wouldn't it be great if just everyone on my team just showed real extreme ownership? Or my team doesn't have real ownership? Or, the generation today just doesn't understand what it means to have ownership. The common word, of course, in all of that is ownership. And and John and I wanted to talk about what does that really mean? Like, what does that mean? It's a kind of could be a throwaway phrase, but similarly to psychological safety, which can sometimes be a throwaway concept, it actually has real value. Extreme ownership, uh, really important terms, really important practices. If everyone's employees and managers and leaders all showed it's a good thing, just like with psychological safety. It's a good thing if it's done well. So we're going to try to unpack that a little bit today. And I think some of the rhetorical questions that come to mind when I think about this statement of like, what do we really mean by ownership? And these are based on observations and talking with leaders, my own experience, reading what people say on LinkedIn, working with leaders. These currently. One example is like, do we mean is this people doing things without being asked, showing initiative? That's possibly one way to think of it, but we're going to explore that. Solution orientation, proposing solutions to problems. Is this all it means? If I want people to show ownership, to bring in solutions to problems in my team? Does this mean that you're touching every part of the process? You're jumping in everywhere you can, every person who's potentially involved in this outcome you're trying to deliver, and you're resolving every matter related to this requirement, this outcome you're supposed to deliver on? Is it doing exactly what's being asked of you and kind of accepting that that's the charge and never going back to the leader and saying, well, I have questions or I need help with it? All of these could be based on potentially accurate definitions of extreme ownership. All of those statements could also be very improperly understood versions of extreme ownership, and each of those have nuance. And so I actually am going to kick it to you, John, maybe just initially reactions to those statements, but then I would love for you to share with our listeners kind of how you see a potential definition of this concept of ownership, and then maybe we can wrestle with that a little bit.
Yeah, if you there's a book by him too, but have you seen the video Jocko Willink about
Uh-huh.
extreme ownership? I
Yes.
think we put that in the show notes for people to watch. I think it's an interesting frame for it. I'm kind of curious to turn it back to you. I've used that before when working with my teams. I can think of one year in particular where I wanted our goal to really be on extreme ownership, which it wasn't just me telling people, hey, do your job better. It was about, what do we do as a team to set each other up well, to know our roles and responsibilities, the things we're going to talk about today. sometimes I don't know that that lands well, like necessarily when you tell people about extreme ownership and what that means as a leader. And I'm curious to get your thoughts. And I don't know, maybe I'm getting ahead of us a little bit, but why? I mean, I remember the video, and I think it's a great video, but some on my team were like, "That's pretty intense." It's this military guy. Just if you
Right.
all don't see it, watch it, where he's talking about a unit that he led in some terribly difficult circumstance, and the idea that I knew I could go into battle and absorb fire from enemies because I knew everyone on my team would know exactly what to do and would take ownership. And then when the mission failed, everyone said it was my fault, like to a T, I guess was the thing.
Hmm.
Um, so I don't know. What do you think it is about this idea? Number one, I think we'll talk about this in a minute, but what is wrong with this idea of saying, "Hey, not wrong, but what can go wrong with
Yeah.
saying I want my team to have ownership?" And why sometimes when leaders do that, does it seem that folks might flinch? What do you
Yeah. I
suspect?
think so. I'll answer that in one way, and then to your point, I think we'll get to how to do
Yeah,
this in a few moments. But I think why are we even bringing this up? Maybe is how I'm interpreting that question a little bit. Like, what's the problem here in just saying I need ownership? I think the problem is it's actually much more nuanced, intricate, and requires a culture, frankly, not just a statement, right? I think the problem I often see is leaders can lament and play this victimy sort of role of, man, we need people to have greater ownership here. And as you'll hear in a minute, the the barrier is not often the other people on the team. It's you as the leader who are saying that without recognizing how essential your role is in creating the conditions for ownership on your team. And so I think the problem here is that it's often a request of others, but when the reality is it's it's you
yeah,
as the leader that are likely getting in the way of creating ownership in others. I actually believe
I agree.
most people want ownership. They want to feel like they have the ability to do things that are in front of them in any part of life. Some of it's a gap in skills, some of it's a gap in maybe mindset, but oftentimes when you're thinking about the lack of ownership in an organization, it's not that people there you hired the wrong people or that they're just lazy. It's probably a you problem as much as it is anyone else's problem. And so today, as we kind of explore this, I think that is maybe the frame for why this is the question today. And that's kind of the essence of why we're getting it wrong.
Yep.
But before we jump into how, I actually, John, I'm curious. I threw a definition in here about what I see extreme ownership or ownership being. Maybe start us off with that, and then we can kind of talk through. Is that right? Wrong? What would you adjust?
Yeah. So Josh, wrote this out. I agree with it. Ownership being knowing your responsibility and not pushing it to someone else or taking over others' responsibilities. So not taking over. We talked about heroism quite a bit on this
Hmm.
podcast too,
Right.
right?
Yeah. Feeling. Yeah.
Um, so this requires a lot. Requires being curious. It requires being self-aware, and it requires courageous. So back to the idea of curious of instead of the first thing always being like, well, this isn't my role or responsibility and pushing it off
Cool.
or saying, well, I need others to do this. The question is who's as a leader, I guess, is like who's equipped best to do this and are they set up well to do it or do I need to own this, right? Self-aware, going to be coming back to like what are my tendencies and how I pursue work and how I think about work and what I avoid, what I pass on and what I'm willing to do and coach people on.
Hmm.
And then being, I think that courageous is going to, this comes for anybody in any workplace, right? And then Josh, you can fill in the blanks here a little bit, but this idea of where am I willing to say these are things I don't know or I don't understand? And I would say the courageous one's really big for me because as a leader, you have to set the conditions where someone can be courageous when they may not understand how to do something, but maybe they want to. But maybe you create the conditions where they either say, well, I'm just going to ignore it because he never explicitly or she never explicitly said that's my responsibility. Or, man, I'm afraid to ask them how to do this thing because I think they're just going to say to me, why can't you figure this out on your own or something like that? Which is, I think, part of the impetus of that when people say, well, I just need more people to have ownership is you're just frustrated because you want them to do it because it's hard for you to teach them how to do it or to show
Mm,
them how to do it or to
yeah.
maybe even admit responsibility that's something you couldn't do yourself and so you're just hoping someone else will do it.
Yeah.
So yeah, Josh, I mean, yeah, build off of that in terms of your how you read into that definition or think about that. I mean, I also in this conversation, there's a part of this. There's part of we're going to have to make sure we're really clear of when we're talking about leader versus the
Right.
people that the leader is talking about and
Yeah.
their direct reports,
Yeah,
right?
great. I'm glad you mentioned that. I think this definition was written initially with the lens of like the person who's being asked to be showing that
Mhm.
extreme ownership.
Yep.
And frankly, anyone in an organization is could benefit from thinking of it this way. Um, so good point. Like this is kind of thought of as if I'm the person being asked to show it, I think this is a definition by which I would operate under, which is I need to know what my responsibilities are and are not. I need to know that it is not my job to push it to somebody else and kind of play, oh, can you help me too much here? Kind of the victim side, or I'm going to take over and say, well, I was asked to show extreme ownership. Now I'm taking over everyone's responsibility around me and kind of powering my way through it. That, of course, is also a definition the leader themselves need to be equipped with in order to be clear with the team about what it does and doesn't mean.
Yeah.
So I think that's a great question to ask. And I'd say, yeah, these qualities of curiosity, self awareness, courageousness apply to the leader. They apply to the person being asked to show it. They apply to everyone in the organization.
I think before I know we're going to talk about the role of the leader, and my head is in the place of like I want to talk about what is the motivation and what what is the motivation of leaders saying this out of frustration. And I want to talk about some terms I've heard, and I think you've heard them too, in whether it's as manager or in coaching situations. I actually hear quite a bit when talking to folks, even in one-off coaching sessions with them, about you'll hear things often of, well, the new people that I'm managing. So I never remember. Are we in Gen X or Z or T? I can't
We're
remember.
Gen Y.
Not
We
us.
can't-
Not us. What's
Oh,
the most
Gen Alpha. Well,
no, no, okay. The
in the
most
workplace,
in the
yeah,
workplace.
Gen Z.
Yeah.
Gen
So,
Z. Yeah.
oh, Gen Zers do this. Well, you know what? I often ask myself, is the thing that I'm saying, and especially if it's in a negative way, is it a unique statement or is it one that's been used a lot? Because I'm going to tell you this before people were complaining about Gen Z, they were complaining about millennials and whatever the problem was with our generation. Before that, you had folks complaining about Gen X and whatever their issues were in the workplace. And before that, boomers, right? From the greatest generation. So I'm just saying, like that sort of pattern. I think what you're looking for as a manager is actually is my statement about how I think about my team. Is it at some level countercultural, or do I find myself using the same isms or statements that others use to complain about people who aren't doing their job? Right. So the better question isn't why don't they have ownership? It's like how do I coach my team on how to understand ownership or how do I create the conditions where they do that? Because that asks a very different question. It's going to turn it back on you, right? And workplaces are busy. There's lots to do. Look, you and I have worked in intense places where you were expected to know everything pretty deeply from you know content expertise to cultural awareness to operations to HR to you name it. Um, But the answer wasn't just be like, "I need other people to figure this out." It was, "How do I position myself to make sure I can see these people and allow them to have success?" Um, what else do you think is there at the heart of this statement, Josh? What is the frustration that leads to this? Like, what else do you hear for that allows us to show some sympathy for people in these situations? Because I think we're gonna put a lot of this on the leader, and I think that's fair, but where does it come from?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. And I don't know that I have a whole lot to add to some of the circumstances that you named there. I think that it's maybe what I would just add is when you're operating in a busy, harried state as a leader, and you're trying to pay attention to all the things happening around you, but you're also trying to be tuned in to concepts and leadership that are relevant, is that you can kind of find yourself saying, well, this is the concept that seems like it would solve my problem. So I'm just going to pull it into this
Yeah.
situation. And then you start saying it and you're kind of building it as you fly. Like I think that was, I mean, for a lot of us in leadership, that's a common phrase. If you're building things as they fly. And that's okay. It's a reality. Part of the reason we do this podcast is to try to help equip you with the tools you need as you're building this airplane up in the air. But I think that the point here is like pause a little bit and think about what you're actually asking and why are you asking it of your team. And if you're doing it reactively, pulling in an interesting concept that maybe you've heard a little bit about or what sounds good, that you probably need to understand kind of where it's coming from. And so I
Okay.
I don't know if I'm answering your question there, John, but I
I just
think
I think it is
yeah,
important for people to think about what the motivation is in that statement.
yeah,
And when you find yourself asking a question, I just want my team to take ownership. It sounds on the surface of I just want a team that we all know our roles. We are moving as like a well-oiled machine and we're moving forward and we know what we do so that nothing gets dropped. But frankly, I think often when we come up with that, there's something deeper and a bigger questions we have to ask of like, what is happening inside of me that I'm asking this question? What is happening in my leadership? That means this is happening. And so I think that'll come out in these statements. So let's just get into this one, which is the role of the leader. And you have some quotes here that I think go along with this, Josh, and I'll
yeah.
ask them and then give you the first at bat at responding to them. Does that sound right?
Sounds
Sure.
good. Let's
Good.
do it.
So this one, I don't, same iteration of these are basically all iterations of my team doesn't have ownership. I don't want people coming to me with problems. I want my team to be solutions oriented.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a very common, like, "Hey, team, I want you to be solutions oriented." Okay, great. And we'll get it's kind of gonna bridge this section in the next, but is it safe to bring solutions? Are leaders,
Yeah.
actually willing to hear the solution? Or if you bring solutions, does the leader actually not want it because if you're smarter than them, quote, unquote, it makes them look bad, right? So, like, if you're a leader making statements of, like, "Bring me solutions," it's really critical that you ask, what am I going to do with it? Who am I going to acknowledge for bringing this forward? What am I going to say if I don't like the solution being brought forward? I go back to what we talked about in a few episodes recently, which was when bringing feedback, who's taking the bigger risk? If you're a leader asking your team to bring
Yep.
solutions to the table, that is a form of feedback being brought to you, being brought to the company. They're the one taking the risk. They've thought about a potential solution to a big problem. If your first thing is to shoot it down and say, that's not a very good idea, or like, hey, thank you
Yeah.
for bringing this, but I'm not actually going to sit on that gratitude. I'm just going to move straight to why I don't think it will work. You've cut them off at the knees. And so I do think that there's a real importance here to say, if you're coming to the table with this, hey, be solutions oriented, no one's going to be solutions oriented in your company if what you do in response to that solution is to fail to show gratitude, is to immediately move to defensiveness, is immediately to move to problems that you see in that solution. Or it might be, wow, what a great solution. Thank you. And then you go to the company, you go to your executive team, your board, and say, wow, here's a solution I came up with. Well, all of a sudden, you've taken somebody else's work, claimed it as your own because your own insecurities got in the way of not looking like you were competent enough. Guess what? Your team is going to very quickly observe that you are not gracious, and they're not going to continue to find ways to really bring real solutions to
Yeah.
the table. So, statement is not sufficient enough.
Agreed. And one thing that's what come up a lot in my coaching, especially I think in the context of people who are really high dominance, really effective in terms of knowing what to do, knowing systems, is we'll talk a lot about like, oh, I just end up giving answers to people and I end up telling them what to do. And they know this is a problem. And I find this solution that comes up a lot, again, comes from Liz Wiseman's book, Multipliers, which is the 80. And we talked about this once before. It's just this 80% rule. Are you actually willing? So, in the case where someone comes to you with a solution, are you willing to say, like, you know what? Great. Why don't you execute on that? Even if you know that the way that they're thinking about it or their solution might only be 80% effective or 80% of what your 100% is. But man, you gave them full ownership.
Yeah.
They felt enabled, they felt empowered, they felt that you provided that to them, so that they can learn from it. So I think sometimes this what happens too is your first reaction is, well, I'm a perfectionist and I hold a high bar, so nothing's ever good enough when it comes to me. That's good. I want leaders that challenge. Don't get me wrong, but if you don't have some sense of like, okay, where can I allow a bit here or give a little to this person, so that they can learn and grow from this versus
Yeah.
always feeling like they're shot down, right?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
you complain about it, but you don't actually know the right path. Maybe your head's too far in the clouds and you throw out these other ideas and then people leave the conversation more confused because you created 15 other solutions to the two solutions they provided. The other one I would argue too is I do think there's sometimes where you have to be comfortable with your folks might come to you and they just say, I don't actually know the answer. So I would condition people to actually say, hey, this is the problem as I see it. Here are some solutions I thought through. Or to say, here's the problem as I see it, and I'm stuck. Can we brainstorm this together?
Yeah.
If you can
Yeah.
teach them both of those ways, the one that I think frustrates people is I don't know what to do. This is messed up. Figure it out. Like what you hear from them is like, this is fallen to hell and there's nothing to do here.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but
I've
then you
hired
start telling
10.
people you have to have
Yeah.
solutions. And sometimes they're like, what if I don't have a damn solution? Right.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah, all good stuff. I mean, I agree. And in fact, John, I think where we're kind of getting to here is moving into like what is required of a leader. I think we can actually just move into some of these qualities here. Um,
but what about this idea of can they act like an owner? What
yeah,
like I actually you wrote these. I think they're good and
yeah. Let
let's
me
talk about this
here.
one.
Yeah,
Yeah.
here. So here's, I think, a couple of. Let me elevate the questions, and let's
Okay.
actually get into like the next part where we dive into what the reactions to these could be. I think a few other things that leaders often say. I want people to act like an
Yeah.
owner. Okay, can they? Are the roles and responsibilities designed to look like that? Let's talk about that here in a minute. But like, I want everyone here to act like this business is theirs. I think there's a lot of questions with that statement because they're not actually the owners, right? And there's a very big difference between being the owner of the business whose whose butt is on the line and everyone else trying to think of the business like that.
Yeah.
Or like this other statement leaders often can say, I just want people to be biased towards action. So I bring up those quotes because I actually think that they're really good statements to think through. And underneath each of those, again, are positive ways of kind of addressing those, and also some problematic ways of kind of using that statement as shorthand that actually carries with it a series of blind spots the leader themselves might have when making
Yeah.
that statement. And so, where I wanted those statements to kind of get us thinking as you and I, but also for our listeners, is if we're making those statements, we need to actually be really explicit about what is required for a leader who might make those statements. Those no problem with those if the elements of your practice as a leader are
Yeah.
present. And some of those elements are what we're going to talk about next.
Bias towards action, think of it if you're on the receiving end of that statement, like your tone and your approach to saying that to someone as a leader is either leave me alone and figure it out on your own. That's how they can hear it, just like leave me alone. Or, hey, I want you to know I trust you. So how can I coach you on when it's kind of more of a green light situation versus like you have to full stop and ask me? Like
Right.
how can we work on this so that you know I trust you a
Right.
bit? So
Yeah.
often these phrases sound fine in a way, but the way you say them or the context within you say them, your people are interpreting their meaning in very different ways.
Yeah. Or even that last one, like, I want you to be biased towards action. Like, what have I been doing the last 3 months? Like, I'm not sitting here twiddling my thumbs. Like,
Yeah.
clearly what you think is action and what I'm doing are not the same things. So like let's move away from these contrived statements and actually get at what it means
Yep.
and being clear as a leader. And so I think, John, one of the places I would say to start would be risk taking as a leader is you have to create the culture in which somebody is willing to take the risk of bringing you a solution. You have to create the climate in which people are biased towards action. And that means that they're going to be actually taking risks where they might be wrong. And if you're going to ask for it, you have to expect that people are going to come to the table with things that aren't maybe the right answer, quote unquote. And
Yeah.
right, I'm putting in quotes. How do you celebrate risk taking? How do you promote people who've taken risks? And even if the wrong answer is what came forward, I want to say, John, I really am grateful that you spent the last couple of days exploring like 4 or 5 different solutions to this really complex problem here. And we've agreed as a team after discussing them that none of them are actually the direction we need to go. But we wouldn't have realized that had you not come to the table, having done the work to bring some ideas forward. And your wrong ideas, as we've concluded, are actually what is going to allow us to make the next right choice. And for that, I am really grateful. Like, how does that sound? If you hear that as somebody who brought some solutions to the table, it was clear that they weren't the solutions we went with, but they were honored and valued as catalyzing solutions towards the actual solution, right? That's a very different way of addressing risk taking than it would be to say, Ah, John, thanks, but those aren't the right things. It just doesn't address the business needs at the moment. Who else has some ideas?
Yeah.
Very different.
Yeah, I mean, like as far as going back to our idea of a psychologically safe place, to our point, psychologically safe isn't accommodating for people all the time and finding ways to make them always feel happy about their ideas. It is about saying, hey, the risk was worth it. We've learned something from that. We're not going forward with it, but keep bringing those ideas, right? Because the next one might be the one we go with, right? Or
Love
whatever
it.
you do.
Yeah.
I would
Yeah.
also note, if you're a listener thinking about this, it's one thing for us to say, hey, allow risk taking. There's I think some prerequisites you have to think about too to make sure that risk taking feels both like palatable to you in terms of what that your teammates and you understand what risk taking means, and that your teammates feel safe in terms of their risk taking. So that still requires that we're setting specific norms for how we think and act, specific ideas of what the outcomes we need to get to are, and expectations around that. And
Yep.
as I start saying that, starts feeling like, oh, you're creating all these conditions under which risk can happen, but that's maybe a part intellectually that leaders have to spend a lot of time asking. If I want to create a team that feels compelled and that they have the ability to take risk, then we need to spend a good amount of time really setting the stage for that to happen well, both for my mindset and theirs. Right.
Mhm.
It's a much longer conversation, probably a longer coaching conversation for a person of how do you do that. But don't just go to your team tomorrow and be like, I want you all to take risk. It has the same outcome in terms of like how you state it as bias towards action if you're not intentional about how do we set that up, right?
That's right. That's right.
Bottleneck, Josh. So this one is another thing required from a leader is them not being a bottleneck. Um, I
Yeah.
mean, I think intellectually everyone's probably like, yep, of course, because we've seen what happens when leadership becomes too tight of a funnel for everything that has to happen. But talk
Yeah.
a bit more on that one.
Yeah, gosh. Yeah, I want my team to be the owner. I want them to bring solutions, and then when you get to them, they come to you as the leader, and you're like, "Well, let me think about this. Let me come back to you on this one. Yeah, let's examine this. Let's bring it to the team. I'm not sure about it." Or, this is great, but everyone is coming to you with all of their solutions, and you're the only one deciding on whether they're good or not. That's just one way of thinking about being a bottleneck. If you want your team to be extreme owners, you've said, this is the outcome I need you to take or to work towards. These are the responsibilities you have. This is your role. And I want you to take extreme ownership.
Yeah.
Go forth. And then as they do all of those things, your anxieties come into play and you're like, oh, hold on a second. Really great. I love how you ran after this project. But you know what? I'm going to have to kind of take it a different direction. You have absolutely prevented extreme ownership. There's no way around it. You can say, well, I got to protect the business. I got to, they're not ready for it. Then
Yeah.
then don't give them the charge and say that that's what you're after, or dial back what you've required as the outcome that they're aiming for. But you can't say it one way and then act differently. And this happens so frequently in a business is the ownership request is met with, well, you told me to do all of these things. You gave me permission to run for this or run after this. And now I'm coming back with a solution ready to execute. And now you're like, nah, I don't believe it. I'm not
Yeah.
sure that it's right. Then you've either lied to them about what you've expected or you've miscalibrated what you thought their ability to own it was. And then you need to have an honest conversation about it. You can do that only so many times before no one's going to believe you that you actually let other people own stuff. It's okay to be wrong as a leader and say, I thought you were ready, but you're not. But if that's always your answer and that is always what you're saying, then frankly, you're not being honest with yourself about what you believe of other people.
I was thinking about bringing this idea up later, but I'll do it here and it might flow into us. A lot of times this equates to decision making rights. And I think to this point, that's maybe helpful for folks instead of just ownership is have you actually set up decision making within your team, right? Who can own a decision? Because
Mm,
one of two things happens when you don't, in this world where we say have some ownership. If you haven't truly defined what ownership means in terms of a decision making framework, what happens is either one, your general expectation is still that everyone's doing a lot of stuff, but all the decisions are made by one or two people. And so then they do all this work. You complain either about that they didn't do enough or quite enough, but ultimately it's because they're afraid or they just assume that you have to make all the decisions. Or on the other hand, no one's making decisions. You get burnt out because you're running around as a leader trying to figure everything out. And then people are like, what are we doing here? And you're just like, I need someone to make a decision. You have to be really intentional And I get, and not everything requires a decision, but in big bold, when you're talking about people's roles and responsibilities and everything else, which we'll talk about here in a minute, and not just saying you own this, but I would go a step further and saying you own decisions related to this.
Yeah, love that. Yeah,
You
so
own, you know what I mean? I think that's maybe a thing I would actually, that might be the big thing for me in this episode to get people to think about. It's not just asking your people to own more, but to be more precise in what you're asking them to own.
yeah,
And
I
in
think
this
that's
case, we're
really
talking about
great.
owning decisions. And if they're going to own decisions, I have to tell them they own those decisions
A
and talk about what that looks like. And make sure
and
you're,
be okay with them coming back to you
yeah,
with a decision that you wouldn't have made, and let them live with, and you live with, whatever happens.
yep. And if they're not ready to own certain decisions yet, that's fine, but create the path for which they get developed and learn on that. And like maybe they have to do a lot more checking in with you now until you
Yeah,
see and have confidence in them, but be explicit with them about that, right?
yeah.
So let's go into the next one, Josh, here, which is another requirement of a leader. I
Yeah,
love this one. People are always being challenged in whatever role they have, especially, and I love this that they have, especially, but within their zone of proximal development. So I don't know how many people on here know what zone of proximal development is, but this just means that wherever you're at in a journey. So in schooling, we talked about for kids, you wanted to always challenge kids so that they're always being pushed to grow. But if the challenge was too severe, then they would just fail. I was actually listening to this great podcast with Nora Jones and David Grohl yesterday. They were like kind of
singers.
yeah, the singers. It's a
Oh
cool
wow.
podcast with Nora Jones where she brings on other artists and they like talk and interview, but then they just do some music together. And so they were talking about him learning as a drummer that his first introduction to this was like Rush, but it was so intense, the drumming, that he couldn't get it. He was like, he didn't get it. Wasn't until he heard some cool punk bands that were little known in Chicago that he saw how simple their chords were, that he
Uh,
was like, oh, I can do that too. And he started doing that and building off of that. So
mm,
this is true of your people you're leading too. If you're not giving them challenges that meet within the zone of where they are, then they might fail. So if you just say, hey, start making decisions on these really complex things, but you've never allowed them to make smaller decisions that anchor up from there,
yeah.
um, then that's a challenge, right? So I talked to a person yesterday as a leader. She was really talking about how she has been defined and she realized has defined herself as the solutions provider. And I said, well, how do you, and so people call her scary. I said, well, what would you rather be? She almost overcorrected. And she says, well, I want to be known as helpful. I was like, well, I think that's going to get rid of some of your edge. What's in between that? We
Hmm.
ultimately went with this, like, she wants to be defined as challenging and empowering, that she
Mm.
challenges people and she empowers them. Right. So what do you think, Josh? What do you got here?
Yeah, I think that that's definitely one way to interpret the statement of people being challenged, is that they have to be challenged in the right place.
Yes.
The other edge of it, the other end of that would be to say, there's a tendency in organizations to put like a premium on expertise. Like, I just need
Mm,
experts in every role, and when we
yeah.
have experts everywhere,
Yeah.
then they can show ownership. I actually would argue the opposite, is that if all you're prioritizing is expertise, then what you're really getting to is complacency. You're getting to people who are less curious, who believe that the reason where they are is because they're excellent at what they do. And as a result, you have an entire climate around you in which complacency is very easy to slip into
Yeah.
it. I actually would argue you are more likely to show extreme ownership over a problem if everyone around you is constantly required to be somewhat curious about how to grow. If you don't have a growth organization where people are constantly being stretched to say, John, you know what? I think that you've nailed this director position, but I actually need you to take on something a little bit different within this role. And you're going to be stretched. You're going to be asked to learn more. You're going to be asked to do some things that are uncomfortable for you. You're going to do some things that are going to require risk. You are more likely to have a team, in my opinion, that is going to show more ownership. I actually think a bunch of experts sitting around in their proverbial towers, their ivory towers, if I know exactly what I'm doing, can more likely create a condition in which ownership is less likely to be shared and shown on the team. What
Yeah.
do you think? I don't know.
Oh, totally. Yeah. Yeah, I love that different framing too of, are you constantly expecting people to move out of their comfort zone, whether that's like kind of within their lane or outside of it, right?
Hmm.
Um, and so yes, I mean, end of that. I think that's like a really important thing. So basically, am I still challenging people to grow this is different than just own it already. Damn it. Okay, just own it. And then you aren't, but how are you intentionally allowing them to own it? By challenging them and upping the ante a bit. I
Mm-hmm.
actually think that fits a lot in with this next one. We talked last time a little bit about as a line manager, as we'll put it. There are three core components of this: being a leader, being a manager, and being a coach. In this space, I think a lot of time when people say statements like, "I just need my people to start owning stuff," they might you might only be in the kind of I'm managing people or I'm leading people standpoint. Like, I'm coming with these big ideas and I need people to execute on it, or I just need to tell people what to do and they need to do it. I think a lot of time in these spaces, people actually aren't coaching people, because if your
Right.
people are struggling to own things, there's a good chance it's because you have like not done the work. And this is where, properly challenging people comes, providing
Mm-hmm.
them with risk opportunities or stretch opportunities, um, and so forth. So the question is, are you then within that context saying, yes, I want them to own more, and here's how I need to coach them. This is what they
Yeah.
need to be developed on. Because you might
Yeah.
be missing that.
Yeah, I mean, I think if there's any themes that consistently come out across all of our episodes, it's that great managers are actually great developers. They're
Yeah.
great coaches, great leaders are great developers. And I think the question of what does it look like to challenge this person is right, but what does it look like to support them as well? Great coaches do both. And if you're just saying go off and own it and come back to me, it could be a lazy, I mean, you have to question yourself. Am I saying this out of laziness? And you maybe say, "No, I'm not being lazy. I've supported my team." I think that's where the curiosity we mentioned earlier comes into play, which is, "I'm curious. I'm asking you to own this, but do you feel equipped to be able to do so? And if not, where are the places that you feel like I can or we can together fill those gaps for you to feel like ownership is going to be is doable for you?" So I think that's a great push, and it actually ties to this last recommendation, which is very tactical, and it's maybe a way to express your coaching in concrete ways, which is, have I defined their role and responsibility and the outcome that they're aiming for? So big picture, roles and responsibilities in theory are going to kind of stretch across multiple projects. I mean, they might be varied depending on your organizational's design, but your organization's design. But if you were to really ask the question, I want people to take ownership, could they tell me what their role and responsibilities are? Because going back to where we started, if people don't know this well enough, then you're going to get into this messy place where people are taking on other people's responsibilities. And I
Yep.
think a lot of people respect that I don't want to do somebody else's job for them. I don't want to step on toes, quote unquote. The lack of clear responsibilities and roles in an organization, man, I can just speak from my own experience. It is incredibly, incredibly frustrating to be asked to both own things and then say, well, there's five of us who you've asked to own this. And I don't know what their job even is. So I don't want to step on their toes. I don't want to take over somebody's responsibility. And if the leader's like, you know what, guys, just figure it out, it becomes a Hunger Games environment.
Yeah.
And like the lack of clear definition is a problem. You could say, well, we want people to be agile and nimble. That's fine, only if there's some degree of like clarity over what it means for each of us to operate with agility and nimbleness in this environment. So if you don't have clear roles and responsibilities defined for your team, that could even include some degree of saying, when we get to projects like this, everyone's going to kind of, coalesce around a collaborative approach to it. Just define it. Just define it for your team. Don't just leave it to the wolves, so to speak, to figure out what it means and then kind of watch from a distance. I actually think that, just as a side note, like the former leader of The Apprentice, who I believe happens to be our president, um, very much operated with that sort of mentality of, I'm not going to define roles. You all just fight over it. Here's the meat and the floor. Figure out who's going to come to the top.
Yeah.
First of all, if that's how you want to lead, you're not listening to this podcast. And if you are listening to this podcast and that's your form of leadership, then you haven't listened to anything that we've talked about for 45 episodes prior to this, because that's not how we believe leadership should work.
Yeah.
But if you are operating a team without roles and responsibilities and outcomes, other than like, we need to win, we need to get to we need to
Yep.
accomplish this vague goal of success. Yeah, gosh, you're doing something, in my opinion, that's just not productive leadership.
Yeah. And what I would tell folks is when you develop this, number one, this is an art to defining roles and responsibilities. It is there's a science to it, certainly, but there's an art to
Sure.
it. And
Yeah.
you have to be intentional. Like if you aren't spending yearly as a leader a good amount of time coming back to your roles and responsibilities charts and adjusting, it doesn't mean it has to adjust a ton every year if you have the same team in place. But if you aren't constantly like looking at it and internalizing it yourself, then there's no way you can properly coach or develop people or stretch them, to Josh's point, and challenge them beyond the current nature of their role. And so a couple things here is, one, I would argue some strategies is spend time with this each year and make sure it's always reintroduced to your team. Again, I don't care if it's the same team you've had together for 5 years, make sure it's always reintroduced. Second is one way to make this a little bit easier is it's backwards planning. You start with the outcome that you want, that is most important for each person in their role, that you know the outcome that and the data metric that you want them to be responsible for, list that, and then make sure that the roles and responsibilities you pick line up towards them actually being the person that helps to achieve that
Great.
goal, right? So,
Great insight.
I mean, I would argue that is a great place. Josh and I have talked about promoting our work, but as people are in this summertime, which is often a time when people are configuring their teams, and it kind of does serve as a reset in many organizations. It's a great place to get an external partner to help you spend time on that, to challenge you on that, and to push you on it. And if you don't want to do that, make sure you're working with members of your team or your managers to spend time on this, quality time doing this. It'll save you headaches for the next year. We promise it.
Yep.
So final thoughts, Josh, homework. Great episode here. Josh put together a lot of the thinking here. But what do you got for us maybe in terms of homework or next steps?
Yeah, I mean, I think as always, pick one of the things that we talked about. Maybe the roles and responsibilities jumped out to you. Maybe analyze the statements that you often say somewhat flippantly and explore, have I created the conditions for me to be able to tell the team, hey, go take some risks, or, act like an owner, or be biased towards action. If you find yourself making these statements, I wouldn't even go as far to say explore internally, do I have the conditions, but I'd go and ask somebody you trust on your team to say, hey, you know, John, I make this statement often. I want people to be biased towards action. Do you actually think people know what to do with that? Like, where am I missing something when I say that? Like, what is people's actual reaction? I think you need to be really curious if you're kind of a leadership statement sort of person who makes these kind of leadership-y sounding things all the time in your organization. Some of you listening do that. Explore with your team, can people actually do what I've said here? Is this clear to people? So I'd be curious. That's what I would leave as a place of homework. Would you add anything else before we close?
No, I do want to echo back to some things that Josh has brought up about this is a reflection. When you do that, when you do what Josh said, it's going back to those I statements or me statements of going to a member of your team, maybe even your manager if you're a little worried about going to people that you manage, although I would argue it's better to go to people you manage. But if you can, go to your manager and say, hey, the story I'm telling myself is I need people to own stuff more. But what do you think is the story that people are telling themselves about why it's hard for them to own it? Or do they think they're owning
Love
it?
that.
So you get back to that I statement. So the moment you find things of like, I need them to do this in any context, whether it's I need more ownership from them, or I need more resilience, or I need more problem solving. Well, let's turn that back. Like, what's the story you're telling yourself? And can people actually do those things, or like versus just telling them to do it? So
Love it.
great conversation. Hopefully big things that people can think about here. We got a couple guests coming up. We are coming to the end here. We're going to do a few more episodes throughout June and then take some time off in July. We'll tell you a bit more about that, but please connecting with us, keep connecting, sharing ideas, sharing thoughts. And until next time, this has been Leadership Limbo, where we make space for the tension and tools for the journey. See you in the in-between.